end of an era is often the most interesting one to witness. Saran, on the outskirts of the Belgian city of Liège, was a true example of a long history coming to an end. In the previous episode we covered the rise of the industry and the rise of this once important steelmaker, Cockerill, one of the most important in the world at one time. In this episode we'll cover the eventual fall of the steel industry, what the early signs were and how this dramatic fall finally began. In this episode we'll follow the Meuse River towards the neighborhood of Ougrée. Here the company of Ougrée-Marié operated its steelmaking operations, which was a direct competitor of the Cockerill company during the period from 1900 until 1955. We'll start at the section called Ateliers Centrales, which means the central workshops. This was one of the most important parts, where maintenance for the locomotives and many other machines was done. During our exploration in 2019, many of the old workshops were already being stripped, so we focused on the remaining office area. The offices were a true testament to the decline of the industry, with some parts already abandoned since the 1980s, often left as complete time capsules. The building itself dates back to 1937, so it contains some nice modernist details. We arrived at one of the first points of interest, which was a massive archive. Right in this place, all the blueprints of the many factories were kept and stored. Some even dating from the late 1800s, all located here. If the buildings had to be renovated or updated, these records were used by the engineers. The majority of these buildings have been demolished a long time ago, making this one of the last true physical remnants of many factories. Today the entire archive has been lost during the cleanup of the building. We continued further into the long corridors of the office. Further on, we came into an incredibly preserved office. This was probably one of the technical offices, with much equipment and many remains left behind. Looking at the first generation Audi S4 on the wall, this office must have been abandoned since the early 1990s. In the long decline, divisions and offices were phased out one by one. But before we spend time on this long decline, let's continue where we left off in the previous episode. With World War II breaking out in Belgium in May 1940, production was halted. The workers and the management were convinced that the German victory was imminent, so the production was restarted in October. With many factories being strategic targets, they were bombed on a regular basis by the Allied forces, destroying many buildings throughout the years. These dark years were known for resistance by the steelworkers, such as massive strikes involving over 100,000 workers, but also for the mass exodus of people from the town to escape the many bombings. We leave the workshops behind to a lesser known remainder of the steelworks. It is an old substation, located on a bare industrial wasteland. Much of the old machinery has already been stripped, so we headed inside to uncover better preserved areas. Via a dark basement, we made it into a large open hall. The function of this hall was to generate electricity, but it was a bit different than usual. While power is usually generated by steam turbines, these units could be started quickly to generate power when demand surged. This could be done in just a matter of minutes. But the units are long gone today, with all the equipment stripped, leaving not a trace behind. Nature has already found its way inside, covering some areas with the first greenery in the normally grey hall. In the back, a large control panel was located, which could control and regulate the process of power generation. It's a typical example of the predominant post-war architecture, grand and large buildings. After the war, Saran's once impressive industry lay in ruins, but not for long. Reconstruction was undertaken on a spectacular level, with brand new state-of-the-art facilities rising from the ground. Thanks to the rising demand for steel, and with the help from the US Marshall Plan, the industry quickly became larger than it had ever been. The substation we just explored was part of this new post-war section. Under Ougray-Marié, one of the most modern facilities in the world was realized, creating quality steel and thousands of jobs. On the social front, the company also provided many luxuries, such as a brand new company-owned cinema. But while growth was consistent, the reality of a changing world was already looming in the background. The main factor was the post-war trend of global trade, which meant that steel mills connected to a port became more important throughout the years. This looming trend led to the fusion of the Cockerill company and the Ougray-Marié company into one, combining both factories. Innovations and modernizations were also prioritized to stay competitive in an already changing world. Further into the substation, we found that the majority had already been stripped of its copper, leaving a mess behind. Finally, we came across the most important room of the facility. The main control room. This room was responsible for regulating the electricity supply to all the factories that once surrounded the substation. It was in relatively good condition, without much gravity covering the old vintage panels. Although preparations for future demolition were noticeable, with floor tests done throughout the structure, it does not bode well for the future of the building. We will leave the substation to finally head over to the most impressive section of the area. The last true blast furnace of the Liège Valley remains. Hoffernol-B, commonly called HFB, was the final blast furnace ever built in the area. The last true investment into the hot phase of steel production. We entered this site via the railway that ran right underneath the blast furnace. Throughout the years, I visited this site around 8 times, so we will skip through many eras and sections filled over multiple periods of time. We start at the old blower house of the facility. The blower house was in a bad condition, but still had some interesting parts, such as the old chemical lab, which was leaking heavily, creating this rather unique scene. Besides this, large parts were burned down by copper thieves, so we skipped those areas. Right along the corridor we came into the main machine hall, which still contained some blowers, although they were heavily stripped of copper. The copper stripping at this site was on a scale rarely seen anywhere. Multiple millions of euros were stolen throughout the years due to it being barely secured when it was shut down. It was a shame that it was in such a bad condition, but it also created a truly post-apocalyptic scene. This site has housed blast furnaces since the 1800s, with several generations built here. It meant that this site had constantly evolved, fitting new technologies on top of older ones. An example is the pre-war blast furnace number 5, which had a unique basket system hidden under newer additions built on top. Such old school facilities are nearly non-existent nowadays, but this made this place so unique. During the 1960s, a series of investments were made to accommodate the new generation of steelmaking. HFB was built, for example, but a state-of-the-art steelworks was also constructed in the middle of the town. At the time, this was new technology and was meant to make it fit for the next few decades. The neighboring Esperance Languedoc company, another competitor in the same town, was also merged, centralizing all the steel makers of Liège under the Coqueril-Sambre company. But these new investments were overruled due to the energy crisis of the 70s, when steel prices and demand plummeted. Saran was in crisis, leading in rapid downscaling and attempts to make the bloated company profitable again. Divisions were rapidly closed down, leading to many layoffs, which in turn led to mass strikes. This was the start of a downward spiral. We were heading to the blast furnace. The cast house was where the pig iron was tapped. This was done at extremely high temperatures. The men working here had the hardest jobs in all the sector, needing to wear large suits to withstand the intense heat. After the molten iron was tapped, it was transported in so-called torpedo wagons to the steelworks. In 1984, a large restructuring effort was undertaken, closing down many blast furnaces, dotting the landscape of Serran. But the recently opened steelworks was also shut down, sparking mass protests. In a way, it symbolized how violently the times had changed, where even one of the most recent investments wasn't enough to keep up. The workshops of Coqueril, which used to produce many things, such as locomotives, had shifted focus to making ship engines and parts for the nuclear industry, but these too were shut down. Ruins of the bygone era began spotting the town, which was also overrun by poverty and depopulation. After many mergers, Coqueril-Sambre became part of the French Arcelor group, which combined nearly all the Western Europe's steel firms into one. In 2006, it was merged again with Mittal Steel, an Indian steelmaker, eventually creating the still existing ArcelorMittal group. ArcelorMittal then closed down many struggling factories in France and Belgium, ultimately causing the true end of steelmaking in Liège in 2011. It was the death of an industry that had defined the region and its people. and, in a way, Wallonia's identity itself. After sitting abandoned for over 10 years, demolition and partial renovation began some years ago. With this, the region faces a dramatic transition from the heavy industry it has relied on for centuries to the search for a new identity and future.